Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we presented the abnormal versions of the characteristics in horizontal thinking. In this segment we will explore the abnormal versions of orthogonal thinking and shared communication. In a constructive sense, most of orthogonal thinking and shared communication concern two parties who communicate varying amounts of interval ratio units of information indirectly. One of those parties is considered to be the aversive party. Constructively, the aversive party makes a decision to separate themselves from individuality in order to interpret some type of social or external construct. This is done for the benefit of the subversive part, who will consider that information in an attempt to draw a conclusion about some part of horizontal thinking. In an abnormal sense, though, most problems can be related to the dynamic between the subversive and aversive parties. One of the most prevalent problems in this type of relation is the phenomenon of shared identity disorder. In this phenomenon, the indirect relationship between the parties will take precedence over each party's individual processing. That is, a disproportional reliance on the opposite party will be displayed even during prompting for other types of communication and other thinking types. This abnormal dynamic leads to a reliance on either party in a way that leads to a tendency to display either a subversive stance or aversive stance in decision-making and communication. Another abnormal version of this relationship is referred to as forced identity disorder. In this sense, either of the parties will choose some version of deactivation in order to obtain a specific outcome of communication. In the abnormal aversive sense, the aversive party will knowingly transmit false or unrelated information in order to see the subversive party obtain some type of process, characteristic or decision that is more closely related to the desire of the aversive party rather than the true interpretation of that information by the subversive party. This is done to align the identity that the aversive party assumes with the identity that the aversive party wants the subversive party to assume. In this sense, the aversive party forces the identity upon the subversive party rather than the subversive party being able to conclude their own interpretation of the communication cycle. In the abnormal subversive sense, a person can tend to choose to give their decision-making process to another. In this process, the subversive party will prefer to put off their own communication cycles in favor of an aversive party completing or interpreting some part of that communication cycle for them. This process of subversive identity disorder can be the preference over other types of communication. There are additional dynamics that are related to shared communication, such as orthogonal impulse and false identity, which will be discussed at a later point. For now we can move to absolute thinking and supersocial communication. In a constructive sense, the process of absolute thinking concerns a process of sorting identities and from there solving the relationship between multiple identities in a way that can be handled by some other thinking type. In an abnormal sense, the consequence of an abnormal or non-standard sorting process in supersocial communication can lead to problems in other communication and thinking types. This happens when an abnormal sorting takes place. This can be caused by an irregular impulse or by a false identity. The processes related to these abnormal sortings are referred to as conditional relationships, disinterests and pseudo-directives. In a conditional relationship, the sorting of identities is more or less fixed to give a specific result regardless of what is being sorted. In this sense, a relationship between identities will always be considered to be high energy or low energy at every instance of the presentation of those identities. This sorting is closely related to identities which are thought to be unrelated or incompatible, especially when those identities have been solved by a different thinking type. Because of this sort of predisposition, when those identities are sorted in supersocial communication, the previous result will always force the sort to be related to that previous result. This leads to a predetermined condition between those identities rather than an organic sorting during their active presentation. This can lead to a certain identity always being related to a high-energy process regardless of what it's being compared to. A related version of this process is referred to as a disinterest. The phenomenon of disinterest of an identity forced that identity to consistently be associated with a low-energy association regardless of the way that the identity is presented. This is more closely related to the identity being associated with an irregular impulse, which can be discussed later. By placing emphasis on the associated impulse, though, the presentation of that identity or the relationship related to that identity will almost always be correlated to a low energy or unfavorable or non-standard process. For this reason, the interpretation of that specific identity is more likely to be deferred at multiple levels of communication. This is especially true when the identity is not organically evaluated prior to that decision of disinterest being made. Another abnormal process in supersocial communication is referred to as a pseudo-directive. In a conditional relationship, the tendency is to apply a certain sorting to a specific identity, especially in a high-energy sense without respect to the true sorting process. In disinterest, The tendency is to assign a single or multiple low-energy statuses to an identity regardless of the organic sorting process. In a pseudo-directive, the process of assigning a sorting value to an identity will be mixed. That is, at some levels of sorting, an identity can be thought of as high energy while, at others, that process can be thought of as low energy. This combination of high and low sorting for a single identity is referred to as a pseudo-directive. There is the equivocal term of pseudo-deferral, however, for the most part, either are sufficient when describing the combination of high and low energy processes for a single identity. Next, the processes of personification and depersonification can be discussed. In the previous examples, the abnormal or non-standard process related to the sorting. In personification, the abnormal process is related to the identity. The process of personification relates to adding an additional identity to a different thinking type. When considering supersocial communication in a constructive sense, the first step in high to low activation is referred to as the supersocial identity. This process relates at least three identities in a way that requires some kind of sorting. This sorting leads to the comparison of the remaining identities to be completed in some other way, preferably via a different thinking type. In the abnormal process of personification, a set of identities which is already solvable using a different thinking type is associated with an additional identity in order to force the sorting of those identities. This process of false association leads to an unnecessary sorting of identities which would otherwise be unrelated. The process of intentionally associating additional identities in order to force supersocial communication is referred to as personification. A further abnormal version of this process is referred to as depersonification. In the process of depersonification brings an additional set of identities which forces an otherwise solvable identity to be re-evaluated. This causes an unnecessary sorting in order to force the previously solved identities to become associated with a falsely high energy or falsely low energy process. This is somewhat related to the abnormal processes of some other thinking types being perpetuated by forcing an extra solve on those abnormal processes, especially in forced identity disorder, disinterest, deferrals, conditional relationship and derogatives as way to further communicate the abnormal interpretation of those processes. This additional solve is meant to reinforce the abnormal nature of the communication cycle or associated identities. There is an additional abnormal in supersocial processing that has already been explained. That process is referred to as gapping. That process is a physiological response to the overactivation or overcomparison of identities. This occurs at 118 characteristics of communication and leads to the inversion of intelligent characteristics as well as their processing. This phenomenon of gapping is important in other abnormal versions of communication, namely compulsive impulse and when considering the dark zone. Those processes can be discussed later. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue our discussion by exploring the abnormal processes of the Z scale.